All right, back for the second part of lecture 11. So we ended up talking about things that would lead to either shifts or movements along the aggregate demand curve. So I want to go a little more into depth because this is a model that we use to basically try to explain what is happening in the entire economy. So we talked about interest rates and their effect on consumption. There's a few other things I want to talk about as well with respect to consumption. We also talked about interest rates with respect to investment, but there's a few other things I want to talk about with respect to investment as well. So one of the things that could lead to a shift in consumption is changes in wealth. And what I mean by that is when people feel wealthier, they're much more likely to consume, even if their income hasn't changed. A good example of that would be during the housing boom. A lot of people saw their homes go up a lot in value. As a result, they felt wealthier. They were more inclined to spend money. How did they do that? In many cases, they did that by refinancing their home, taking cash out of it like an ATM, and using that to buy all kinds of things that they always wanted. When the housing bubble burst, a lot of people saw their home go down in value. Now, maybe nothing happened to their income. Maybe they had no plans on selling their home, but because they felt less wealthy, they also cut back on their consumption. So changes in wealth will also affect consumption as well. Future expectations of prices and income. So if you think that prices are going to go up in the future and your income's going to go up as well, that might lead you to buy now. Why is that? Because even if you had to borrow money to buy this, let's say you thought the home prices were going to go up, and let's say that you thought that over your working life your income would go up. Well, it would make sense then to go out and buy this home now because its price is going to go up in the future, and you've got the income to be able to pay for that. Does that make sense? We talked about interest rates, personal income taxes. One of the reasons why the government gives people a tax cut when the economy goes into recession is because they want to put more money into people's pockets. What are they hoping people will do with that extra money? They're hoping that you will go out and buy stuff, right? So if taxes go down, the assumption is that you'll have more disposable income. If you have more disposable income, you'll consume more, and that'll lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Another thing is money supply. So who controls the money supply? Later on, when we get to money in banking, we'll learn that it's the Fed. The Fed has the ability to print money out of thin air if they want. So if they were to increase the money supply, that money would eventually find its way into your bank account or somebody else's bank account, and that could lead to more consumption. On the other hand, if the money supply were to go down, and I'm not saying that this would be intentional, but it could happen, then sooner or later there's less money in circulation, and that'll lead to less consumption. So how would the money supply go down? During the housing crisis, a lot of people were not able to repay their mortgages. Eventually, what has to happen is a mortgage that's non-performing, meaning somebody who hasn't made a mortgage payment in 6 months will lead the bank to charge that off. And when they charge that off, they have less money to lend out. We'll get into that again in money and banking, but they have less money to lend out to other people, and that leads to a shrinking of the money supply. So it's not only bad for individuals when they borrow too much money to buy homes that they can't afford, it's actually bad for the economy as well. Okay, so let's switch gears and go to I. Determinants of investment. We talked about interest rates. If with respect to people, it's the same thing if you're a company. If all of a sudden you see interest rates going up, there are fewer things that you can invest in. You'd want to borrow money to invest in because they're not going to provide a rate of return high enough to pay those interest rates. On the other hand, if interest rates went down, that makes a whole lot of other things possible. Expectations about future sales. If you're in business and you think that the future looks bright, then you might have to invest more today in order to sell more products in the future, right? You might have to either build up inventory or make inventory if you're a manufacturer. On the other hand, if you don't think things are going to be that good, there's no sense in acquiring more inventory, or there's not even any sense in investing in new plant and equipment to make inventory because you don't feel optimistic about the future. Business taxes, if the tax rate that companies pay were to be cut, one assumption we might make is that businesses would take a portion of that tax cut and put it back into investing in plant and equipment, investing in the company, doing something that would make them more productive. And then, of course, money supply. If, again, if the Fed increases the money supply, some businesses are going to see that show up in their accounts, and they'll have to do something with it. Even if it's paying it out to the owners in dividends, they're still doing something with it that should lead to a higher aggregate demand. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, we're going to talk about that more in this clump of chapters, but fiscal policy is the president and the Congress getting together to look at spending and taxing. So, if the government were to spend more, that's usually what they do when the economy goes into a recession. The hope is that that would keep the economy from further sliding into a recession. But then again, they have to pay for it somehow. If they were to increase taxes, that would take money away from people. So maybe what they would do is they would cut taxes at the same time that they increase spending. I know that sounds crazy. That would lead to bigger deficits, but maybe if you're an economist of a certain point of view, that's exactly what's needed. All right, then we'll get into another thing called crowding out. Crowding out is when the government borrows more money, and as a result of borrowing more money, interest rates go up. As a result of interest rates going up, we see a reduction in private consumption and we see a reduction in private investment. A thing called total crowding out would occur if, let's say, the government borrowed $1 trillion more because they wanted to I don't know, rebuild the roads, and they also wanted to give people a tax cut, and that was going to increase the budget deficit by $1 trillion. So let's say as a result of that increased borrowing, the interest rate went up and we saw a reduction of private consumption, let's say of 800 billion, and a reduction of private investment of 200 billion. That would be complete crowding out, because we've got a $1 billion increase in government purchases leading to a $1 trillion increase in government purchases leading to a $1 trillion decrease in consumption investment. And then finally, when we talk about net exports, what are the things that determine that? People's income in other countries. People do buy American-made goods. Like I said before, we're one of the largest exporters in the world. We run such a huge trade deficit because we are super consumers and we're the world's largest importer. But when people's incomes in other countries rise, they do buy more American-made products. They have the ability to pay for those kind of things. And then, of course, the exchange rate. If our dollar is weak, that favors our exporters. A lot of people say, well, why would we want a weak dollar? Well, it's not that we want a weak dollar. Maybe you do, but nobody will ever say you want a weak dollar. If you have a weak dollar, it makes imports from other countries more expensive, and it makes our exports more competitive. So, I mean, one thing Trump could do if he was worried about the trade deficit is maybe he could make the dollar cheaper. Maybe make it harder for Americans to buy goods and services from other countries. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the aggregate supply curve. Now, in this model, there are actually two aggregate supply curves. One is called the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the other is the long-run aggregate supply curve. So first off, let me point out some of the differences between our aggregate supply curve and our product supply curve. So when we're in our aggregate demand model and we're seeing an increase in the price level, this price level increase is occurring because all firms, all producers are competing for scarce inputs because they're trying to keep up with demand. Maybe there's been a rightward shift in aggregate demand. And as they try to buy more inputs, the cost or the price of inputs winds up increasing. If, on the other hand, we were back in our product land, maybe it's a product for one good or something like that. An increase in the market price only leads to an increase in output of that good as producers respond to higher prices, but it's just that good. It's not goods across the entire economy. Maybe we're lucky and we're making a product that everybody likes, and so that's why we're seeing demand increase, which is leading to a price increase. Okay, input prices. When we see increases in real GDP, this is something happening throughout the entire economy. It's affecting everybody. It's not just affecting us, it's affecting our competitors, it's affecting people in other industries. And that's the thing that's going to lead to input prices going up because we're all competing to try to get the same inputs and they're in limited supply. On the other hand, if we had an increase in input prices for the product that we produce, then that's actually going to lead to a decrease in supply, right? Now, remember the example I gave you of hops and beer. Hops is an input towards beer. If all of a sudden it costs us more money to buy hops, we're not going to be able to produce as much beer, and that'll actually lead to a leftward shift of the supply curve for our product. It might lead to a rightward shift in the supply of something else, but for our product, it'll lead to a leftward shift. It's not necessarily a movement. So let's talk about the short-run aggregate supply curve. We've got real GDP again on the x-axis, and we've got the price level on the y-axis. We're showing the short-run aggregate supply curve as being upward sloping. What does it mean if it's upward sloping? It means that as we get to higher and higher levels of real GDP, in other words, as we move in this direction on the x-axis, the price level rises. So why would the price level rise? Again, you've got firms competing for these non-labor inputs and also workers as well, right? First off, let me clarify what I mean by non-labor inputs. These are things like the cost of capital, maybe borrowing money to buy more plant and equipment. Maybe land prices are going up. Maybe you do something that requires more land and the rent you have to pay has gone up. Maybe the cost of natural resources has gone up. And even if these things haven't changed all that much, it might be hard to find a worker. And so the only way you can hire somebody is to offer to pay them more money. So if you see an increase in this and we move this way on the from left to right, we're moving upward along the short run aggregate supply curve. And if, on the other hand, and if there was less economic activity, then we'd move downward along the short run aggregate supply curve. All right, so let's talk a little bit about things that could lead to an upward movement along the short run aggregate supply curve. We get this increase in real GDP, one of two things is going to happen. Either we're going to need more of these inputs because they're not of the same quality to produce the same amount of a good, or we can find the same quality inputs, but we're going to pay more for it. Either one of these two things are going to lead to an increase in unit cost. The unit cost is how much does it cost me to produce 1 unit of a good. I wish you could see me right now. I'm standing behind or sitting behind a desk. If I were to touch the desk I'm talking about or sitting behind and say, let's imagine that we make these desks. What are the costs that go into producing this desk? Well, we've got a certain amount of wood, we've got a certain amount of fasteners, we've got a certain amount of woodworking that we have to do, so we're going to have to pay people to do that kind of thing. So the cost of the unit cost of one desk essentially is the cost of producing one desk. In other words, how much does our wood cost? How much do our screws and all those other things that we use to assemble the desk cost? How much does the labor cost in order to put that together? So what we're saying is when there's more economic activity, when we move up from left to right on the short run aggregate supply curve, we're forced to bid up the cost of these inputs in order to get enough for us to be able to produce. That leads to an increase in unit costs. We're not the only one experiencing this. This is happening throughout the entire economy. And so for that reason, it's going to lead to an increase in the price level. On the other hand, if the economy slows down, meaning real GDP decreases, we move from right to left on the real GDP axis, then there are fewer people competing for these inputs, fewer people competing for workers, fewer people competing for materials, fewer people competing for things in general. And so as a result, we're either going to see a decrease in the price of our inputs or we're going to see an improvement in the quality of our inputs for the same price. Either way, according to our model, this should lead to a decrease in unit costs. We're not the only ones experiencing this. This is happening throughout the entire economy. So this is why the model predicts that we will have a decrease in the overall price level. All right, so let's talk about short-run equilibrium. The short-run equilibrium occurs at the place where the aggregate demand curve intersects a short-run aggregate supply curve. So we have some level of real GDP. I'm going to call this Q. In this particular example, I'll call it QE. For the level of real GDP where aggregate demand intersects a short-run aggregate supply curve, and then there's some price level We'll call that the equilibrium price level for this. This is our short run equilibrium. There's also a long run equilibrium that we're going to talk about as well, but just keep this in mind. I'm going to end this here, and then we'll talk about the long run equilibrium when we get back.